Hello everyone, today we talk about Alexios I Komnenos' accession to power, the Norman and the Cuman invasions of the Byzantine Empire, and the Komnenian administrative reforms in these first years of Alexios' rule. I've never made, if I'm not wrong, a comprehensive video about Alexios the First. In any case, we will come back on the topic often, because as you know, this is kind of a milestone in Byzantine history. We're looking at one of the most successful emperors and commanders in Byzantine history that, however, today we will also appreciate in terms of actual also defeats as he collected in this initial phase. So this is interesting. For example, I made a similar video about Basilius the second, say, price of reconquest, right, and how this also favored in perspective the rise of the Komnenians, the collapse, as you know, this traditional centralizing system that the Roman state had fundamentally still ingrained, and instead heading towards, and we will see it today, a kind of pronoia system and privatization of the same state, the same court that occurred under the Komnenians, that at that point rose to power to a moment in which that process wasn't irreversible in absolute terms, but it was essentially more beneficial to pursue, given the in fact management of the system in the previous decades, in order to compact in a more effective fashion. And this does have to do also with the of course the military dimension of the empire. First of all, of course, the disaster of Manzikert, that has been overly exaggerated, at least in a deterministic sense. The Byzantine Empire didn't have to go just after Manzikert. We talked about Emmanuel the First Komnenos, incidentally, regarding Myriokephalon as well. But definitely that blow had significantly contributed to the further privatization of the system. Equally, it had showed how reliant the Byzantines were already at the time, at least not the battle in itself, but if you know the story, that even the Crusades somehow stemmed from not just what happened after Manzikert per se, and actually by the time of the First Crusade, the Seljuk onslaught was already over, and their power was fragmenting already, but rather the Byzantine requests for essentially Western mercenaries that were already present in many ways since in part even from the Viking era. It's a bit the same concept of the Varangians, but not quite only, right? There is an important Latin presence at this point from the Mediterranean that the Normans of Robert Guiscard embody from their Sicilian power base that was now to become essentially the most dangerous threat for the empire, way more than the Turkish one, right? And so what eventually seen Komnenian times is, of course, a reinforcement of power, but at the end of the same dynasty, essentially a collapse that would occur in 1 century from the times we're discussing here, exactly at the hands of the Westerners. And for reasons that are hotly debated, we, at least again, always in the deterministic kind of, like, did this really have to happen? No, okay, but why did it happen, right? Was there something that was making it that was substantial enough by scale not for us not to ignore? This is something we're not looking at. But I guess that observing the Norman invasion at the time of Alexios the First accession, and also the Cuman one in part, allows to highlight in a way from one side, of course, the resilience of the empire, but from the other, also the unavoidable fragility that any of these pre-industrial systems had. I mean, at some point, the Komnenians would be almost able to knock out the Siculo-Normans in Italy, which that's how you go, right? You have just to shift the balance enough for making enough things, in fact, collapse, and you can really have even the crumbling of a civilization. In many ways, this is what happened to Constantinople as well, and in this case, some enemies went pretty damn close to achieve it, even before 1204. In any case, what we look at the beginning is, of course, the rule of Nicephorus III Botaniates, that had been essentially a great general, historically had risen to power through the turmoils that had occurred in years before this. We don't have time to digress on. And under him, the circumstances were spinning out of control, right? Because the Turkic presence in Anatolia was threatening also the Aegean. The entire system had been shattered in many ways, and he had to keep things together. And of course, the greatest problem, as we just said, were other external enemies, like the Turks, that were not just Turks, by the way. We often think of Manzikert, like, first of all, this is, the first time in which the frontier collapses. Actually, by that scale, of course, the Anatolian hinterland was lost. It was a major change in a lot of assets. The land base for the most powerful course of the Byzantine army, of course, was lost, especially the Tagmatic cavalry. But first of all, the eastern frontier had already been penetrated by lots of peoples. Yes, Turks, but also Georgians, even Russians, Kurds, and lots of those people settle alongside the Turks that also were pretty fragmented in the same Anatolia, right? The Sultanate of Rum is established. That is already per se like kind of a separate chunk from a broader Seljuk power, and would remain, in fact, decentralized. But in the same Anatolia, there are lots of other baronies, fundamentally, that are created, and that were not ruled from Iconium, and that would allow, on the longer run, in fact, the Byzantines to reconquest most of it, if it hadn't been, again, for Myriokephalon, so proving that the thing was possible. In any case, a much more compact power was threatening now Constantinople, and we're talking about the Normans of Robert Guiscard. We haven't made so many videos about the Normans as such, nor about the Siculo-Norman kingdom. Today will not make up for it, but as you know, this was one of the single most successful policies of the time, because it relied heavily from, in fact, the extraordinary resources of southern Italy that was practically recompacted after centuries of divisions, and under this Frankish power, because basically when we talk about the Normans, that's what of Sicily, but that's what we're looking at concretely, that manages to centralize by unprecedented standards from a Latin Germanic point of view. The Siculo-Norman kingdom was even more centralized and powerful, actually, than the one of England as such, and it was pretty damn close to the Balkans that could be easily reached by ship, right? In the sense, the Normans, from one side, restrained the communal development in southern Italy, but also relied on the most important coastal centers, as far as, especially as shipbuilding was concerned, and they were able to mount up this major invasion of the Byzantine Empire at this point. The commander of the Byzantine Western armies at this point was Alexios Komnenos, right? So he was just called to solve this task, However, he lacked at this point the direct control of the empire as such. Constantinople was ruled by Nicephorus. The Komnenoi naturally were well based in the same Constantinople, because, as you know, this is a time of also the reinforcement of the Achaia in that privatizing direction. And so there are just essentially a bunch of aristocratic houses that rule the empire that literally controlled the quarters of Constantinople. Alexios was young at this time, and he found himself in a dire situation, because in order to successfully halt the invasion that the Normans were putting up, and doing anything about also his future, because he was the commander of the same areas that were to be invaded, he needed the Constantinopolitan power. And that's why in spring 1081 he struck Nicephorus. In fact, on April the 1st, Alexios, with the help of his brother Isaac, but also the support of the Caesar John Ducas, seized Constantinople and managed to overthrow the old emperor that fundamentally was made a monk and thus segregated in a monastery. So the coup was successful thanks to these familiar and other political connections in the capital. In the meanwhile, the Normans were moving, though, as Robert Guiscard and his son Bohemond of Taranto had crossed to Epirus and laid siege to Dyrrhachium. That is, as you know, at the beginning of the Via Ignatia that leads straight to Constantinople, an axis west-east. Now, Robert justified his invasion by proclaiming that he was essentially coming to restore the rightful house of the Ducas, another, in fact, as we've seen, just very important Byzantine family, to the throne of Constantinople herself. This is interesting because, this wouldn't quite happen again, even when in 1204 things were turning right the way they would, for actually reasons of dynastic struggle within the same imperial family of the Angloi. But it already shows an attitude which is typical of these new northern conquerors that were truly believing in their epopee to be opening again this great south to their domination, to restore the divine order over what they saw as a decadent culture, at least one that, as warriors, they thought superior, and thus already dealing with this monumental power of in European history of imperial and Roman tradition as essentially something on their own. Remember that the Normans had been installed in Sicily as papal vassals, so there was, of course, a huge Western interest in already, penetrating, subduing, and possessing the Eastern Mediterranean, as far as so the relation between the the churches of Rome and Constantinople were pretty strained. In the same period, as you know, the popes had basically been carrying out a monarchic reform of the fact of the Roman Church and beyond. So there is much in the Norman epopee that resonates in this invasion, right? That was, again, an incredibly threatening one, right? It's not, these invasions are remembered, the Normans would infest the Aegean, the Ionian seas, and sack cities like Thessaloniki, and thus proving, also during the same crusade a few say a decade later, with the same Bohemond of Taranto, beautiful passages from Anna Komnenos, the description of the Westerners, of the Franks, of the Celts, as we're also called, in the typical Byzantine classicizing way, of this literal threat from a strategical operational point of view, of this massive, well-orderly, disciplined, impactful armies that could literally park themselves at the gates of Constantinople. So, of course, there was a broader cooperation of some kind, but the situation was more politically strained than just the Normans or the Byzantines were involved, because, as you know, the Roman Empire had actually sheltered a lot of Anglo-Saxon refugees after their defeat at the Battle of Hastings. So the Guiscard, the Hauteville were another thing, right? But they still, were, of course, connected with the Duchy of Normandy, and they did see the Anglo-Saxons as yet another people that they could fundamentally simply step on and lord over at their pleas. So in the Byzantine army, there were, as a matter of fact, Anglo-Saxons. I made a video about this that is actually about the Varangian Guard, but that shows how in the same Epirus invaded by the Normans, or at least around those times, we have in fact archaeological evidence of, for example, of dracones of the same type that you can admire on the Bayeux tapestry from the side of the Anglo-Saxons, interestingly enough, that are essentially a relic of the migration era in Germany. The dracones would be used until the 13th century, and that's how close the world of the steppe culturally really is in time and place to Western Europe. And so it's a dramatic showdown here. Much was at stake that more like a Siculo-Norman invasion of the Byzantine Empire. That would have been already a big deal per se. Would have not been possible without this background. And actually, Robert Guiscard was made very dangerous exactly because of this slogan that he had employed, of restoring the Ducas on the imperial throne, as there was actually a dynastic fundament to that that could be exploited to cause a regime change. It could have been also in fact hegemonized by the Normans, or at least with some winning some guarantees in the process, and likely some possessions in the same empire. So it was a big deal for everyone involved, of course, and the situation definitely for Alexios was not the best, because the situation was still pretty shaky politically, institutionally, for the same reasons for the ones from the previous years. But Alexios, and this emerges prepotently from his actions, sometimes some people say foolhardily, but also in this case without much of another option, frankly, assembled all the available forces and made with such army to Dyrrhachium, Durazzo, whatever you want to call it. That, as you know, it's the most important city in Epirus at the time, and it's just across like the Otranto Strait. So from the other side you have Apulia and the fiefs of Bohemond and his father, and so on. So that's definitely an important crossing that was troubling the St. Venice, that didn't want to be choked and bottled up in the Adriatic, and it was supporting the Byzantines. But the Normans at this point had really quite of a force mobilized. And the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081 is actually a Byzantine defeat, right? We will see it hopefully in detail, but in other words, Byzantine troops were no match for the Normans, nor the the Varangians, and the Anglo-Saxons that were within them. So there is in many ways a the superiority of modernity advancing over in some ways the stagnating models, right? It's a bit like the end of the Viking era by a degree, but also again the emergence of a potent feudal Western Europe that is having its say also in the Levant in a moment of dramatic crisis of the Byzantine Empire. Here it's useless to make some broader strategic or tactical analysis, if not realizing that the Battle of Dyrrhachium and the Byzantine defeat were actually far more serious in under many points of view than the same defeat of the Imperials at the hand of the Seljuks at Manzikert. And we tend to somehow overlook this aspect, in part because, of course, in a broader Western sense, we say, the Turks arrived, and so that's a big deal. But if you actually look at them, they weren't that impressive force that, could, especially so westwards, in fact, inflict a deadly blow to the Byzantines just alone. Look at what, again, the Siculo-Normans were doing, for that matter, and you'll see there much that, even in the same Crusades, in my opinion, is not fully appreciated nowadays, that the Western, the Frankish cavalry was actually pretty well suited even to cope with the Turkic tactics that weren't at all like, this you couldn't run after them because they always feign retreat. There's no way to win guerrilla. This is this typical kind of Vietnam trauma syndrome of some sort. Study the actual military history of the Crusades and see from a tactical point of view what the Westerners had put together. Not to say that, of course, also what happened from a broader strategic or political point of view doesn't matter, but that's also to be contextualized, of course. Now, this was a huge blow, because the Norman army, after the victory, essentially advanced in the Balkan hinterland across the Via Ignatia. That was, again, the major highway crossing the region longitudinally since Roman times, and arrived pretty damn close to Thessaloniki. That fundamentally was the second and de facto only true city in the empire, right? The others, as we'll see now, had fundamentally been declining in some sort of more of towns, with some increasing dependence in the same Constantinople that exactly from Komnenian times will count to treat, for example, Crete just as a personal, backyard of the Komnenian oikos, right? But Thessaloniki per se was not the objective of the Normans, right? It would become in later times also for raiding purposes, right? Rich city, you want to pillage, and so on. But at this point, the Hauteville had actually a more ambitious strategy aimed properly at occupying Greece, and the key to it was the town of Larissa in Thessaly. If this had fallen, the Normans would have been free to swarm into the rich provinces of Hellas and the Peloponnese, that would have thus been lost, right? Because at this point, it's worth noticing that at Dyrrhachium basically was the imperial army with the Varangian Guard that had been crushed, right? So at this point, there is no way to recover even major centers if they fall in the hand of the Normans, right? The most sensible strategy is trying to prevent the Normans from capturing them, which you can carry out with lesser forces, but that can wear out the enemy that, of course, also from his side has began to enter like deep into your territory, and thus has its logistical lines pretty strained, especially during a siege, and the Normans had actually relied on their impactful heavy cavalry that, as you know, put a dramatic strain with the war horses, the incredible amount of food and water that they consume. The same army, especially during the siege of Larissa, right, to be bogged down. I will make a video at some point about properly the hygienic precautions that these armies took, including, well, not stationing for too long in the same place, which in the case of a siege is a bit the whole deal, because it's essentially an attritional warfare, right? On their side, the Byzantines were inferior in open field. They had been shattered morally by Dyrrhachium. Thus, they would be very careful not to engage the Normans in battle, in open battle. Alexios thus relied instead on skirmishes, hit-and-run tactics, to wear out the Norman supply lines. And in this way, he was able to make the Normans rising the siege of Larissa, and even enforcing them to evacuate Thessaly, right, to prevent the collapse of the entire army that at that point may have endangered the same Italian mainland. Now, the Norman threat was, however, ended only with the death of the same Robert Guiscard in 1085, which also opened to a succession crisis in southern Italy, and even the withdrawal of the Normans from the bases that they had established on the Epirot and Ionian Island coastline, which naturally had been, abandoned during the main struggles and could not be successfully supported against, coming back Byzantine force on the enemy, in fact, on the same enemy mainland. This was like a close one, right? The Byzantine Empire risked to essentially be crippled for good because of the Hauteville invasion. And for the same reason, Alexios emerged from this first test with an improved reputation in Constantinople. Right, the price had been high, it had been felt, but at the same time, a major threat had been averted, right, and the Komnenos had been in charge of the whole thing. Now, another turbulent front, as always, was the Danubian one, that, as we've seen many times, had been left as a major frontier where, let's say, the locals had very often escaped kind of direct control of the empire, but it was partly to avoid the Magyars and any other ruler from the north to enter too deep into in fact, Byzantine territory, and finding also important installations, infrastructure. So a lot of guerrilla, a lot of raids, skirmishes, movements of people, as we will see now. However, the riverway represented still a major strategic asset, and it was important to secure positions, especially on the mouth of the Danube. Alexios aimed at the fortress town of Dristra, which was controlled at the time by the Pechenegs, so a Turkic people whose power had been straggling, in fact, most of the northern Black Sea coast as a essentially nomadic or semi-nomadic people that would always thus cause problems at the frontiers because of the raids, of this essential impossibility to strike any major sedentary center, right, to cripple them. And the other option would be just to chase them into the steppes. So pretty complicated, and especially in this difficult times for the empire. And the Pechenegs had, of course, a military power just on their own. They could compact when the Byzantines came to besiege that fortress, and relying on their hit-and-run tactics typical of the steppes, managed to catch Alexios by surprise, and as a consequence, another imperial army was lost in 1087. This was, again, we have a few details about this military engagements overall, right? Especially this ones in the north. But it's obvious that that there was a broader political and strategic intelligence behind them. Thus, winning or losing is, of course, a matter of, in fact, superiority or inferiority, but the difference is narrow, right? Especially when the expeditions are larger and the odds are more balanced. On this occasion, Alexios had also been lucky to have escaped alive, just as at Dyrrhachium, and the situation was dire, if not, again, disastrous, because the Pechenegs pushed south towards Constantinople herself. Naturally, the city had never been in fact stormed because of the imposing Theodosian walls and the general capacities of the center as such in moral and material terms. However, after two major defeats at such a short distance in time, the Byzantine military losses were barely replaceable, and thus the capital was just exposed, not just to the Pechenegs, but also to another danger that was coming from their ally Tsakas, a Turkic Amir who had turned the Aegean town of Smyrna into a pirate base. This was typical of important coastal areas of Anatolia that after Manzikert had basically been occupied by the Turks that could thus take the sea. The Turks didn't have like a fleet, right? But they could harass significantly the major maritime routes on which the empire, and especially the Macedonic capital, relied on within the Aegean, right? So the Pechenegs and the Seljuks there were actually going in tandem to wear out Constantinople. And in fact, the capital was practically what between, say, in the winter 1090-91, Alexios controlled. Right? Yes, there were some other avamposts scattered in the empire that he had connections with, etc. But de facto, the possibility of levying an army or using any other relief force was practically no there. And on the contrary, the Pechenegs could afford at least large numbers, arguably not very qualitative, because they were mostly light cavalry. So at this point, Alexios bet everything just on the very last forces he had, that basically consisted of his retainers, right, or the ones of his relatives and supporters in Constantinople, and he headed for the port of Ainus at the mouth of the Hebrus, that is the Maritsa River, in the hope, at least, of preventing the Pechenegs from linking up with their Turkish allies, because the latter had been also, swarming as war bands, in fact pirates on the Byzantine coast and so on, so they could definitely join forces with the Pechenegs. So what was the game changer here, for which we remember, of course, the Komnenian dynasty in the first place? Well, it's the appearance of another nomadic people, the Cumans, who had just crossed over the Danube into the Balkans. Because, of course, this was, again, a pretty sensational situation, where, of course, these peoples of the north were just awaiting for falling on the sedentary agricultural lands of the south, and there was really nothing, as we've seen, that the Byzantines could oppose against them. However, these groups were always quarrelsome with one another, and albeit the Cuman original intention was to cooperate with the Pechenegs, Alexius succeeded in winning them over to the imperial cause. In other words, he told them, look, we have the chance to crush the Pechenegs, and as Cumans you can fundamentally reign supreme, or almost, on their land and their people. And naturally, consider that these nomadic populations had broader fantasies of loot, and they had a dramatic strategic projectional capacity, because they just sustained themselves by laying waste this territory, consuming the local resources as locusts, but in this sense because they knew that they didn't have the civilizational capacities to rule over, advanced cultures and administering them and so on. So after all, yes, they could have grown richer and fatter by sharing some part of the empire's lands in case of Pecheneg success, but their bases were in the steppe. And so there were, I'm of course approximating, there were other elements within the Cumans, weren't just nomads, but chiefly, right, the backbone of their army consisted of peoples settled fundamentally in the pasture lands of the north of the Black Sea. So the Cumans accepted to help Alexius, who, thanks to their help largely, crushed the Pechenegs at the Battle of Mount Levunian in Thrace, where the campaign was taking place. As a consequence, the Pechenegs, as a people, essentially ceased not to exist, but to count, right? These peoples eventually split up, right, and mixed with others. The Pechenegs as such, we hear of them afterwards, but fundamentally they're not quite the same. Some were absorbed by the Cumans, of course, that became kind of hegemonic, and as such, also a potential threat to the Byzantine control of the Balkans, because at the end of the day, the millenary dynamics in the region between the sedentaries and the nomads remain the same. However, in 1094, Alexius managed to defeat the same Cumans outside the walls of the towns of Anchialos on the Black Sea. As a consequence, you realize that an important Byzantine presence on the Danubian frontier that properly equated to a direct occupation of these strongholds, properly towards the mouth, actually what most of the trade downstream would arrive, and that's what the Byzantines fundamentally needed to control, was established. Right, this was an important achievement. And as we were recalling before, Alexius displayed actually a great determination resilience, tenacity, in the face of all these strains. I mean, just think about what it morally means to be at the head of the Byzantine Empire in such... first of all, like you would argue, of course, that being an 11th century ruler, and especially the one of the universal empire, right, of Rome, was just entailing some standards that today the average person can't even dream of. But just think of the fact, as always, as when you are in charge, what kind of burden, right, is felt on your shoulders, and how crushing it can be. People can't get broken, right? Fatigue can simply crush them, right? And actually resisting just to the weight, right, to destroy their decision-making capability, etc. Alexios here demonstrated a massive stamina, and even in the face of major defeats that we can't ignore, were essentially caused by him still, right? And there's a broader criticism against him because, again, this I am always skeptical whenever I should study this from the actual sources, but I always see in these events some kind of logic that cannot be simply dismissed as, you were jeopardizing the Byzantine control of the Balkans because, why? Because the empire was shaken and some peoples invaded you, and you had to sell forth to actually crush them in order to resume the initiative, which is the most important thing to have in warfare in the first place. Well, that's yet to be seen. In any case, two major defeats, like the ones at Dyrrhachium and in Thrace, cannot be ignored. And in this regard, it's not just, of course, a matter of strictly military fortune, but also of civilizational soundness, right? And the final victory of the empire is also meaningful, because there are not just battles, or at least, the war was not over in both cases, as we've seen. How did Alexios make it? Well, that's where we look at the power base of the Komnenians for how it would be structured from this dynasty on. As Alexios was supported by his mother, Anna Dalasane, who had de facto been governing Constantinople while her son was on campaign, keeping control of the capital and managing to meet with Alexios' military requirements that, as you understand, were also quite difficult to satisfy in such a strained situation, right? And the way they would succeed in this was also by using a harsh administrative regime, right? Byzantine society was, in a sense, ready for that. Not quite in a positive sense, because as we've seen, there was essentially a dysfunctional and critical reality behind that. But with brutal means, they managed at least to find what was necessary. There was naturally not just a self-reliance on his family, but also with other great families of Constantinople that, after all, were in the eye of the storm themselves, and a broken empire would have damaged them as well. There was a lot of competition among these aristocratic factions, one of which Alexios was, in fact, the leader of, right? This also meant, by the way, that had he failed, he would have easily been overthrown, because there wasn't quite much of another succession principle at that point, and there were other powerful houses that could have easily taken the place of the Komnenoi. However, one important aspect was also that all these families were married into each other, so the Komnenoi had blood ties with all the other aristocratic families that had strengthened the interest in the unitary purpose of such establishment, was becoming ever more elite and kind of compacting wealth and riches through also these marriages, these inheritances, and so on. This seemed a necessity after the state had significantly weakened itself in the previous generations, and even before, aside from the parenthesis of the Macedonians that had tried, as you know, to put things together on the base of the centralized statal model of ancient times. While Alexios fundamentally turned this familiar family business, literally, into a principle of government. This took the form, at least in a more, in fact, institutional way, of a radical alteration of the traditional honors system. You know that there were in the Byzantine government a series of offices, of titles, of charges, etc., that essentially stemmed, albeit readapted already by Komnenian times, from the ancient kind of court roles, right, or statal administrators. That is a bit like, in fact, a hallmark of Byzantine policy since Constantine, right? And this stemmed again from a much broader set of offices, also of a statal reality that the emperor had autocratically in Constantinople come to subjugate, to control in a kind of, in fact, monarchic form. But that still was quite, it was quite public in nature, right? There were several titles. They belonged to the administration. They were not a private personal possession of an establishment that went beyond the state itself. Instead, in Komnenian times, these things changed, and we're informed of this mostly by Alexios' daughter Anna Komnena, right, who perceived quite clearly these paternal reforms as a major achievement, and undoubtedly, right, this made things work concretely. So the previous hierarchy of titles was surpassed by a dynastic one, right? If we could sum up approximately, which means that the most important thing to say the most important requirement to cover these offices was to be part of the imperial family, and thus not having pursued another career. Of course, the imperial family would be involved personally in all these major political, military, and social events. There are terrific passages from also the relations between the bloodkins, but also the in-laws that always wanted to stab one another at the table. Like, there are these things documented, are pretty interesting. It was a way, also kind of a paranoid regime by a degree, because plots were always there and so on, but keeping these relatives slash enemies, so potential, because as bloodkins they could thus become the next emperors in many ways, close, was a way to control them better in many ways. And this is typical of, in fact, of oligarchic regimes in many ways. And there is, in fact, also another institutional evidence there that the sum and number of honors that by the 11th century made up the traditional system basically was inflated, didn't count anything in terms of governmental practice. So Alexios reformed this by reserving some, not just older titles, but mostly new ones for the members of his family. For example, the imperial epithet Sebastos, which fundamentally is Augustus, so from auge, and so the sense of properly being venerable and superior, and of course referring to the divinity of the office. Remember that in the Byzantine culture, it's not the Patriarch of Constantinople to be the Vicar of Christ, because there is also no such thing like the head of a church, or at least there is, and it is the emperor himself, right? So he is literally the Christ mimicking and symbolizing figure. In the West, you have at this point the Pope and the Emperor that have split the role, and the term Sebastos Augustus was, as you know, traditionally boasted just by the guy who was in charge, right? Even probably in early imperial times, the heir successor, even though there was never quite a formalization of that, because in fact the sense was that the next emperor should be somehow consensually chosen by the people, right? It was called Caesar, and there wouldn't be any other kind of, yes, of course, Roman emperors mostly came from the same dynasties, and or at least at some point in when these titles were first created, and they had covered other offices and so on, but it was still part of a kind of an individual cursus that had to be in fact you had to go through also in a broader system that would judge and evaluate you and so on. At this point instead, it's under the Komnenians that the Augustan title is extended fundamentally to all the family members, right? Which, as you understand, does have to do with some sort of greater sacredness also of blood, at least conceptually. So this is interesting. One could think of how much foreign suggestions had contributed to this, but it's also mainly a political, a consequence of the political situation. So the Sebastoi that became a very distinct group in the hierarchy, and they did have their own gradations. Of course, not all the members were equal or meant to be. At the top of came the rank of the Sebastocrator, right, which was a conflation of Sebastus and Autocrator, so Augustan ruler fundamentally, which Alexius created for his elder brother Isaac, we have seen had helped him also to carry out the coup in Constantinople, and that had in fact shared the burdens of the imperial office. In fact, such a title was obviously a very big one, like the emperor would have been similarly conceived, right, as the Augustan ruler. Then there would be the rank of Proto-Sebastos, which went to the emperor's brothers-in-law. So these were people that, as you know, in Byzantine history, we've seen it very often, did tend, and not just in case of the death of father of the in-law, and of course of the offspring from the imperial female, the Porphyrogenita, would install his children as successors, right? Sometimes it was always the bloodline that actually counted. So the male one, I mean, and so we have seen it in different times. Look at Basilius II Youth. There were other emperors that, of course, were, I mean, not emperors, because the official emperors were always the Macedonian dynasty, but that de facto ruled, and also had married sisters, etc., of the rulers. So that this was complicated. So you understand it was already, actually centuries of, if not more, of dynastization of power would just naturally be there. However, this idea that you would be a proto-Sebastus, so a proto-Augustus, and you, as you had been married to the imperial blood, was quite significant, and that's why also the barbarians wanted so much to marry the Porphyrogenitae, princesses, because it was framed by the Komnenians but it was already before, because again the barbarians especially believed the most in this kind of blood right, but of course a kind of Augustan level. Then this rank was normally combined also with the position of protovestiarius, which was traditionally a rank conferred to an eunuch, right? So these were historically the chief officers of the imperial household. They controlled a bit all how the court worked. So you understand they had a great power, because they literally had a surveillance, control the treasury of the court rituals and so on. That at least they were aiding the emperors in this function, so they were pretty damn close. And the reason why they had been eunuchs, of course, was a matter of physical integrity, because this was valid in general, not just for the fact that they were castrated. They couldn't have children. They couldn't, in fact, in the court, not cause some, unwanted successor to appear. But it was a thing, like, as far as the properly... this was true also in the West. I mean, there were rulers like, Frederick Barbarossa's father that lost one eye, and so while he was fighting for succeeding to the throne of Germany, but just because of that stopped, because he knew that he could not be chosen as he was menomated. At this point, the problem of the eunuch was surpassed completely. Why? Because these problems did not exist. No, but because, first of all, eunuchs had proven politically to be, as slippery as other figures, because they could still somehow plot and support other candidates, and so on. But at the same time, as we were saying before, it was, from one side, better just to, like, the blood ties, familiar ties, were not always optimal, of course, but they somehow were, again, like a family brand, right? The Achaia were always more compact. The inheritance was shared. So it was these people' interest just to properly be close to their kins, in many ways to maintain power directly without external figures, right? And in general, this could help also preventing other plots as becoming part of the imperial family just as an external, in fact, member of another aristocratic house could pass through, in fact, being part of the family, not wanting to disrupt it, right? And there is no doubt that the Komnenians were the last great, of course, there were the Palaiologoi afterwards, but it was a much smaller empire as well. So, I mean, they were properly embodied in many ways the peak of the medieval Roman civilization in Constantinople as a family, and that's how we mostly remember them. Not even just a dynasty as such, but as a very close-knit group that would administer such enormous power, by the way. In the past, also, office and rank had brought lucrative salaries. So the competition for power mostly passed through this. You can understand how also the need to concentrate everything privately derived from the loss of control in these offices. In other words, also through the devaluation of the same, from the actual control of power and the dysfunctionality of the system, the fact that the center could not control the periphery efficiently through the former offices as well. The reform in the honor system carried out by Alexius essentially finished this, because at that point, being part of the family already meant to share profits, right? For example, the pronoia, as we know it, so this system of essentially administrative and fiscal privileges over specific areas of the empire established mostly, at least developed the most in Komnenian times, that some parallel to a quasi-feudal system, well, almost, right? It was not quite the same thing, because it was, in theory, the state was still unitary, right? So these measures were still publicly taken. It wasn't like in the West, like a beneficium that was given by, as a sort of private contract between the king, in this case the emperor, and the vassal, right? This was just, again, the fact that you were part of the imperial family made it just like you can rule here, right? As we were saying before, Crete literally was the Komnenians, right? It became like the supply province of the empire for the Constantinopolitan of the Komnenians. That's it, right? That's why, for example, controlling the Aegean was so crucial for the city, just that had always historically relied on imports, and so the Byzantine thalassocracy, in spite of its shortcomings, had somehow always ensured this. So you understand better also why the Venetians, other Latins, essentially eroded the power so much. It was eventually, we've seen today, the Normans that actually invade the same Balkans, but in 1204 it's the French and the Venetians proper together that combine this major strategic force that was hitting fundamentally at the same base of the fact of the Byzantine power, both at land and at sea. It was a product of long erosion of the centralized system of the Byzantines. In any case, by eliminating the previous honors, you would just be, again, in the family you could rule, and you had to bring naturally your own resources, because you weren't literally living there, right? These members, yes, went back and forth sometimes, but they would always come back at the court in a way. They lived together, and this ensured the fact that they were, again, a broader firm, and they were cooperating to make it succeed, as the empire would become that factually. In the past, similar grants had been made out of the imperial domain. However, what Alexios did was extending the principle to state lands as well. In other words, by making your family members as the highest public officials, you could parcel the empire among them through a series, essentially, of appanages. Right, and there is no doubt that the Byzantine world was somehow feudalizing as well, just by broader social, political reasons. We've seen them, especially in Macedonian times, where the various reforms enacted by at least the most centralizing emperors were properly designed to stop, in fact, abuses, the defending the middle, let's say the medium landowners that had historically been, in fact, the backbone of the Byzantine military, but that were essentially giving way to the feudal, to the big landlords, the ones who really could simply occupy large estates. This could be seen with the armies, the private armies of the Bucellari since the 6th century, right? And there is always a continental dimension of the Byzantine Empire that must be, in fact, properly understood as a different world from what was properly the core land, that is the coastal one, the Aegean one, if you want, the Greek one, that had culturally controlled the interland since in the ancient world, right? And it's obvious that, albeit the cities depended on the interland control, the major landlords there were also sometimes difficult to dislodge, right? So to give offices to people that would just abuse of them didn't seem like viable anymore, profitable anymore. Or there had been a balance held on that before, but now this had shifted so much in favor of private oligarchic assets that as we were saying before, it didn't make any sense to try to keep reverting it, right? And so the Komnenians embodied this as a dynasty. It's obvious that the Komnenians also didn't rule everything. There were lots of other aristocrats who basically participated to the imperial government, because there were, of course, other offices in standing, some also of the older ones, and thus other families that were parceled other lands that they also historically owned personally, right? And this was just, it may seem a radical step, but at the end of the day, again, the situation had already obliged the system to react like that. And I mean, especially after the threats coming from the Turks, the Normans, other peoples, as we've seen today, the sense of the need of security, the need of protection, the need of having, just in these countrysides of the 11th century, just think we were saying about it before, like the nomads usually raiding with lots of other Balkan mountaineers. The Aegean, the land from the Aegean watershed of the Byzantine emperors, needed to be protected. Who could do this? Like, peasant communities couldn't support that. Is a bit what is happening in Western Europe, right, in the 10th, the 11th century. Essentially, the feudal system affirms itself for the same reasons: need of protection, being under some powerful lord you have just to work for, but not necessarily going into war for it by a degree, because you don't have the force, right? This doesn't happen peacefully. The peasants want to be free, but at the same time, they can't be free just on their own, right? And this would be very interesting to analyze in other videos from a strictly social point of view. But what we see with the Komnenians is just, again, this terrible threats, the loss of Anatolia, the sudden loss of security of a space that in the previous centuries had been successfully reconsolidated after the Islamic invasions of the 7th, the 8th century, seemed to it was lost, right, and wouldn't quite be fully recovered. At least the Komnenian times would be splendid in many ways. So yeah, the system managed to re-expand, but it was doing so because it had somehow tightened the grip on those same resources that say now we're being squeezed de facto, right? Great debate on whether the Byzantine Empire was less competitive than, say, the West for how it was being formed. There is no doubt that in the Byzantine Empire, in spite of the Roman legacy, there is no match there from, there is no comparison between it and the Italian communes, and also from terms probably of land power with feudal armies of the West. Like, something is really just remaining compact together, but apparently with ever greater cost and ever greater erosion, right? And this should be explained in ways that go beyond also the strict, socio-economical issues or whatever. It's also probably how the Byzantine mindset had been built. Over an autocratic order was immutable and fundamentally a denial of any possibility of change, because there is nothing that can change if you have a perfect order. This was the problem of the Greeks in ancient times, that still believed to be free after Rome had conquered them, and still in a way that the Byzantines were kind of into thinking again that they were superior to anybody else, and that's always a double-edged sword, because they had been, but especially the events of the 11th century were starting to prove that the West had really an extra grip, and it was practically impossible to even reason, like in Justinian times, of the reconquest of the West or whatever. It just basically was an equilibristic system that was eventually shattered to destruction, whereas Western powers, in spite of their, of course, fluctuations and the dynastic problems, feudal difficulties, and even, I don't know, the Byzantine counter-strikes, we were talking about that for the Siculo-Normans, for example, still founded essentially the same powers that we see today, loosely, meant, right? And so with a culture that survived in that longer, and that we should perhaps come back appreciating, of course, giving its due to the Byzantine world, that was amazing, right? It's a major civilizational accomplishment, no doubt. What we see here, and what the Komnenians did, I'm actually, very interested. I also had the pleasure of studying, especially the reign of Manuel the First. That is, at least I made an exam at university about, but it's also a matter of adaptational capacities. And I mention also Manuel because he was the one among the Komnenians that, in a sense, opened the most to a possibility of further westernization. Right, with Alexios, we're still in times where they would stick just to the older models, even if they had completely already changed them in a radical way, because again, things change, and those who are able to adapt fundamentally do it through an active capacity of some sort. And if they don't, they have to be prepared to, because otherwise disasters happen. Alright, for today, however, stop it here. We will keep talking about the Komnenoi. I made a playlist about them if you're interested, so you can check all their content out there as I make it. For today, however, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.